Sampling is a process that's performed in almost all social science research. Without it, many research projects would not be possible. This lecture introduces you to the basics of the sampling process. Sampling can come in many forms and can actually be a quite complicated process. But here we're just going to introduce you to the basic foundational ideas of sampling. Sampling is defined as a process of selecting a small number of cases in a way that will accurately represent a larger number of cases. The key is that our sample needs to accurately represent the population, meaning that it needs to have roughly the same kind of characteristics as our population. That is, if 55% of our population is female, then 55% of our sample also must be female. Does that make sense? Do you get it? Yes? No? Maybe? Let's go through an example. This will help you understand it. Let's say we're doing a study of Americans. America is made up of a series of individuals, about 350 million of them. All 350 million Americans make up what we call the population, that is, the group of people we're interested in studying. Each of the 350 million individuals within that population is called a case. It's one person within the population. When we sample, we're selecting out some portion of this 350 or so Americans and placing them in our smaller subset. This smaller group of people is specifically selected to represent our population. It's the group of people that we'll ultimately be working with. It's the ones that we'll actually collect our data from. Because the cases in our sample are Americans, and this is what we want to make our conclusions about, this also happens to be our unit of analysis. And in sampling, this is also what we call a sampling element. Now you might think that all three names are here just to confuse you, and you wouldn't be wrong, though each have their own important meaning in their own right. Thus, the sampling process is simply selecting out cases that we can look at that will accurately represent the population that we're interested in. Knowing the process doesn't tell us why we sample. It doesn't tell us why it is important that we do this process and we do it correctly. We sample for a lot of reasons. One of the main reasons is it's simply too difficult to talk to everybody in our population. It's simply too large. Think about how difficult it would be to talk to all 350 million Americans. It's faster. It allows us to get our research done much quicker. Because if we do it correctly, the sample will accurately represent the population, we can still make conclusions about the population, the thing that we're interested in, without actually having to talk to everybody in the population. This is very useful. In some cases, our sample may apply to a broader population beyond the original population we're looking at. This is called generalizability. Now, before you run off and start collecting some samples, it's important to keep a couple of issues in mind. Not all samples are created equally, and some are simply not as good as others. In later lectures, we'll learn how to draw a really good sample and the correct processes you should use. When your sample does not represent the population, you have erred. That means that your sample is not representative of your population, and therefore you cannot make conclusions about your population. Remember that our goal in sampling is that our sample accurately represents our population. Therefore, the characteristics on our sample should be roughly the same as the characteristics in our population. When they're not, we have erred. But if we can remove error, we have what they call a representative sample, a sample that we can then make conclusions about our population and answer our research question.